coming out. And welcome to Coffee with the Curator. If you don't know me, my name is Rachael Holstege, and I'm the Associate Curator here at the Flint Institute of Arts. Today I'll be giving a presentation, as you know, on the 8 and a New American Art, which directly relates to our exhibition that we have in the Hodge Gallery right now, American Realism, 1900 to 1950. So I know you all have seen it, but if you have not, make sure after this lecture you go take a look at the exhibition so you can think about some of the themes that I'll be talking about. Before we get started, I want to thank Big B Coffee for sponsoring this series of talks, as well as the Ford Foundation Equity Fund of the Community Foundation of Greater Flint, who make it possible for us to have ASL interpretation at our public lectures. And thank you to our interpreter for being here. And last but not least, thank you all for coming to the FIA and supporting our programs. I see so many familiar faces, and it's great that you're always here to support the museum.
Only this time.
That's okay.
I'm trying to turn it down.
You're fine. Just a quick note for our next lecture, that it'll be on February 12th at 10:30, same place, and that will be given by our Director and Curator of Collections and Exhibitions, Sarah Cohn, and her talk is titled In Motion, the Art of Alexander Coulter. So that'll be a great lecture, so make sure you mark your calendars to come see that. So let's get started. And also, if you haven't, please help yourself to coffee, and there's some donuts there. And if you feel free to get up during my lecture, do that. So our current exhibition in the Hodge Gallery, like I said, is titled American Realism, Visions of America, 1900 to 1950. And it's all about how American artists were defining the early 20th century through their art and their realistic depictions of daily life. Now, when you first walk into the gallery, you're greeted by the scene that you see here. And the first section of the exhibition is all about this group called the 8. And you know that's what we're going to be talking about today. And it's all about their impact on the art world through an independent exhibition that they had in 1908, which is going to be our focus. And through this exhibition that they had in 1908, they showed the American public that contemporary art did not have to follow the status quo or stick to popular trends. Instead, art could be a reflection of the artist's time, place, and individual personality. In fact, the art didn't necessarily even have to be visually pleasing, but rather whatever the artist desired it to be. In this lecture, I'll outline how this one exhibition in 1908 affected the American art scene and introduced the world to European modernism later on. It's about the tenacity and ingenuity of 8 men and how seemingly small moments can change the trajectory of history. So a quick note to be transparent. In our exhibition, we actually only have 7 of the 8 on view. Poor Everett Shin got left out. It's nothing against him. I swear, this exhibition is a collaboration between the FIA, Kalamazoo Museum of Art, Muskegon Museum of Art, and some private collectors, and it just happens that none of us could get our hands on an Everett Shin. So, nothing against him. I really like his artwork, actually. I'm very bummed, but he's left out. So, on February 3rd, 1908, an exhibition of paintings opened at Macbeth Gallery in New York City. The exhibition features 63 paintings by 8 American artists: Arthur Davies, William Glackens, Robert Henry, Ernest Lawson, George Lux, Maurice Prendergast, Everett Shin, and John Slum, 8 men that you see on the screen. They would soon be collectively known as the 8, and the impact of the exhibition created a change in American art scene that would continue to grow for decades. The exhibition was the first presentation of an important new kind of distinctly American painting that directly rebelled against the academic trends that dominated the American art scene at the turn of the century. On the screen, you'll see this is the original catalog from the Macbeth Gallery. You can see it was titled Exhibition of Paintings. We have our artists listed, and it was on view from February 3rd to the 15th, 1908. Before we go into the 8, who they were and what their paintings looked like, I want to discuss what they were rebelling against. Who were they trying to go up against? And that was the National Academy of Design. The National Academy of Design, which I'll often refer to as the Academy, was founded in 1825 by a group of painters with the intent to promote the fine arts in America through instruction and exhibition. So this was an art school, but it also was an exhibition space as well. By 1900, they really were the authority on American art. They were the main art school. There were other art schools, but they really dictated the trends, and anyone who was trying to get ahead of American art would be exhibited at the Academy or would be part of the Academy. Unlike today, when you go to New York City and there's just hundreds, maybe even thousands of art galleries that show contemporary art, during this time, there was not that. So there weren't these small individual galleries, there was the Academy, and that was the place to present contemporary art. Museums, today we have contemporary artists in our museums, but museums were the same way. Those were reserved for historical art and rarely often had contemporary art on view. So if you were a living artist at the time, the one place that you could guarantee that your artwork would be seen would be if you were accepted into an exhibition by the Academy. Well, all American artists wanted to be part of the Academy, so they were very selective on who and what artworks were shown. Not only was the jury selected, the jury was made up of artists, but they were selecting art that looked similar to theirs, and we'll take a look at what that looks like in a moment. And they really dictated on what they felt art should be and what it should look like. And this type of art was known as academic art. And those who were accepted into the Academy were known as academicians. Academic artists essentially worked in a style that reflected classical art. It's sometimes often referred to as well as American Renaissance art. And these artworks were filled with allegories and focused on idealism rather than realism. So for example, one of the most prolific artists, academic artists of this time, was Kenyon Cox, who you may recognize the name. This is a painting by him on the screen there. He translated American values into paintings that contained classical images, figures, and symbols of Greek or Roman mythology, much like all the other academic art. He actually actively argued against new artistic art movements and advocated for what he termed the classical point of view. On the screen is an example of one of his paintings titled Plenty from 1908 that exemplifies this classical point of view. The painting represents the bounty and plenty that comes from Justice. So Justice is the woman depicted, and she is giving out her bounty to these children who represent these different ideals such as art and poetry. Another prominent academic artist of the late 19th and early 20th century was Francis Davis Millais. On the screen is a painting by him titled An Autumn Idyll, which depicts, again, two classical women on a marble terrace, fit with classical columns around them. Idyll means happy, peaceful, and picturesque, which is in line with the idealism that this academic art strove to convey. Paintings like these that we've seen by Cox and Millais were really the standard for academic art and American art at the time. Anyone who was not conforming to these standards had no chance of being exhibited, and thus their artwork was likely never to be seen by the public. Another sort of quirk, we'll say, about the Academy was the use of a physical hierarchy within their hanging system. So their rooms are kind of like what you see on the screen here, where the artwork, we call this salon style. The artworks are all hung on top of one another, whereas in many cases, if you go through our museum, we sort of have a center line that we hang on. Sometimes we stack, but for the most part, a painting is just hung right there. So what they did with this was they created this hierarchy where what they felt were the best paintings would be hung at the center line, and then anything that wasn't the greatest would get hung above or below that. And it really obstructed the view in many cases. You can see there's paintings all the way at the top there, which in many cases were very difficult to see. So it really created this sort of physical barrier between these artists. And just because an artist would be accepted into an exhibition by the Academy does not mean that their artwork would be prominent or really be able to be seen very well. It might be shoved in a corner, and they were very strict about the categories of the artwork that was shown. So what does this have to do with our 8 artists? Well, 3 of our 8 artists were actually inducted into the Academy as academicians between 1905 and 1906. Robert Henry, William Glackens, and Ernest Lawson. And really, Robert Henry is our ringleader here. He really started this whole thing. So in 1907, he was selected to be on the jury for the National Academy of Design's spring show. And he was very pleased by getting this role because he was very outspoken about wanting to accept more contemporary scenes and different styles into the exhibition. And he really felt like this was his moment to make an impact on art. On March 1st, 1907, Henry and 29 other academicians viewed 1,500 works for the upcoming exhibition. Henry quickly became frustrated as he watched the jury members become more and more critical of any contemporary art that was not strictly academic that they saw. 5 of Henry's colleagues, he was also a teacher, so several of his students, received low ratings, if not outright rejections. He became outraged, voicing his opinion that, quote, his fellow jurors were apparently reluctant to set aside their conventional convictions about art in order to yield for innovation, end quote. He wanted the works to be reevaluated, which the jury actually agreed to do, but they went through this whole process again, and the jury ended up kicking out some of the artworks that had previously been accepted, sort of just to spur Henry. It was kind of this very personal fight that they were all having. His friends Glackens, Lux, and Shin had been rejected this second time. So Henry, what did he do? He withdrew all of his artworks that were going to be in the exhibition, and he stormed out. And he ended up later splitting from the Academy in all.
Oh, that's so.
Yeah. So Henry was very vocal about this issue and what had happened to anyone that would listen. And because he had a background in newspaper illustrations, he went straight to the press to talk about these sort of injustices that he was seeing within the Academy. This is an article from the New York Times from early 1907, and it's titled, "Condemns the Academy, and thank heavens it has no monopoly on American art." The author, E.C. Caswell, who was a graphic artist, goes on to describe that in the most recent Academy exhibition, he was surprised to learn that 33 of the contemporary artists that he felt were the best and most original had failed to be admitted. He actually goes on to quote Henry, who says, quote, "I'm afraid that a large part of the Academy is against all that is real and vital in American art," end quote. And then the author ends it by saying that he is almost ashamed to be an American, but let us take heed, for thank heavens, American art is not confined to the Academy. So there were others who were thinking, you know, why is it only the Academy who is defining what art can be, and how can we change this? So what transpires next is really where our story begins. But let's talk about quickly who these 8 men were and how they ended up coming together to form as a group. So John Sloan and William Glackens were classmates in high school. After graduating from the Pennsylvania Academy of Art, they started working as illustrators for the newspaper, the Philadelphia Press. They befriended Everett Shin and George Lux, who also worked at the press, and these 4 became known as the Philadelphia Four. You'll see that these men love to give themselves nicknames and like group names, so this was one of them. They eventually became acquainted with fellow Pennsylvania Academy of Art graduate, Robert Henry. Henry, who we know was very outspoken about his views, started hosting meetings in his apartment, sort of like salons, where he and his contemporaries would talk about art and politics of the day. And these men all coming from a newspaper and illustration background, became known as the Charcoal Club, these 5 men. Within the club, these 5 were thinking about ways that they could circumvent the National Academy of Art. They felt that they needed more manpower, so they reached out to more artists who were, like them, were mid-career, established New York artists. Maurice Prendergast came into the fold when he was included in another exhibition a couple years prior with Glackman's Henry and Sloan. They soon welcomed him into the circle, although you'll see that his art and these next 2 men don't really look like what these other artists were doing. Regardless, they felt that he was moving in an original, unacademic direction. The last 2, Ernest Lawson and Arthur Davies, like Prendergast, are kind of an anomaly in their artwork. But they also felt like they had these similar views about what art was and what it did not have to be. In March of 1907 was this incident that happened with Henry and not being, and with the Academy and the jury selection. And in April, the 8 men met for the very first time. It was at this first meeting that they decided that the best way to get back at the Academy was to open their own exhibition in an independent gallery, which today, artists do this all the time, but artists had not done this. This had not happened before. The group decided that unlike the Academy, there would be no judge, no jury or prizes, no hierarchy, and they would all be given equal space within the gallery to present as many artworks as they could fit into that space. And the artists got to select what artworks they wanted in there to best represent their artworks, which is completely against everything that the Academy stood for. By May, they still didn't have a venue for the exhibition, but word had gotten out that there was this sort of revolution brewing. And again, Henry had these contacts with the press, so he told them, this is what we're doing. And in May of 1907, the first article about the group appeared in the New York Sun, and this was almost a year prior to the actual exhibition opening. So this is a clip from that very first article, and this is the article where the name The 8 was dubbed, and where the men started embracing this idea that there are this 8. So this is from the Evening Sun, and they published an article titled 8 Independent Papers. Subheadlines read, to give an exhibition of their own next winter. And I think the next line really summarizes it best. Not an academy of the rejected, but an organization of men who paint things as they see them. No members of one school, one exhibition. In the article, the author refers to the group as the 8, which they come to embrace. And they go on to explain that they will be having an exhibition next February, and that they are essentially going against who they call Big Brother, the Academy. And the Academy had responded, and at one point, and they didn't respond many times, but the one time they did, they called this group the Apostles of Ugliness, because of what their artwork was portraying. Yeah. Yes, right? But they, the 8 embraced it. They took anything that was thrown at them and sort of used that for fuel for their fire. In the article, the author says, quote, also, the little society hopes to grow in numbers by taking in anybody who has something to say about life in its own way and does not paint by an algebraic formula, which is what these academic artists were painting with. The 8 were quoted within this article, and it was summarized by them saying, we've come together because we're so unalike. We don't propose to be the only American painters by any means, but we do say that our body includes men who think, who are not academic in the hard, unfeeling sense of the word, and who believe above all that art of any kind is an expression of individual ideas of life. We often are called devotees of the ugly. The author then states that the 8 who have banded together have done so only because they think their exhibition will make for an advancement in American art. They are not followers of a creed or a school, but nowhere could you find 8 men so absolutely dissimilar, except that they all agreed to paint, drawing, tone, canvas, composition, and color are but parts of technique and that technique is not an end in itself, but a means to a great end, which is life. So with this plan in place, the artists just needed somewhere to host the exhibition space. So earlier I mentioned that there were no sort of independent galleries that were showing contemporary art. Well, there was one, and this was Macbeth Gallery, which was located on 450 Fifth Avenue in New York City. It was founded by William Macbeth in 1892, and his sole purpose of the gallery was for the exhibition and sale of American paintings, which no one else was doing. Henry knew Macbeth, and he knew that this likely was their best option for their venue. And they couldn't afford rent of their own space, so they went to the gallery and asked if they could strike a deal. In May of 1907, Macbeth was approached with the idea, and he was hesitant, but he was very interested in the cause. Eventually, he agreed to let the men have both gallery spaces within his building for $500 and 25% of the sales of the paintings from the exhibition. So today that would be equivalent to about $3,000, which for artists who, were mid-career but also sort of starving artists was a lot. But the artists all agreed to pay an equal sum in order to host this exhibition. So this is a picture of the inside of William Macbeth Galleries. And you can see right away that this isn't from that specific exhibition, but it's from a similar time period. You can see right away that they're not doing the salon style hanging. They're hanging on the center line, which gave each artwork its own prominence. And each artist was given 25 feet of running space, and they could choose as many artworks as they wanted to include in that space. So on the screen here, you'll see these are 8 paintings, one by each artist, that were actually included in this 1908 exhibition. So if you take a look at this, you can see that really by no means do these artworks really flow together. Some of them are kind of similar, but they're all very disjointed. And that wasn't the point. They weren't supposed to all look great together. They were all supposed to show the different aesthetics, styles, and compositions that American art could be. And they were by no means academic in any sense. They were all unique to themselves. So I did mention earlier that Prendergast, Shin, and Sloan were kind of anomalies within the group. And maybe without them, the exhibition would feel more cohesive, but again, that wasn't really the point. But the artists that you see on the screen, these 5 artists, Henry, Blackens, Lux, Shin, and Sloan, did come together and become part of what was known as the Ashcan School. Again, all these names for all these different groups. So the term Ashcan School came on later to describe urban and realist paintings. It was not an organized movement. It wasn't an actual school. It just was a group of people. There was no leader, it had no manifesto, and it really was not a unified group. They weren't getting together and having meetings or anything like that. Really, it was a style that the unification came from artists that had a desire to tell certain truths about the city and modern life that had been ignored by the more genteel academic tradition. So these scenes within the Ashcan School depicted things like people from the working middle class, sex workers, street urchins, people going out, drinking, and things like that. And the artists employed a dark color palette, and the paintings were usually composed of rough brush strokes to evoke the movement and the grit of the city. It was all about depicting modern life, even if it wasn't what some would consider beautiful or even appropriate for art. The name itself, Ashcan, is a really tongue-in-cheek phrase that, again, these artists decided to embrace. There was a complaint in a newspaper about this type of art, and the author of this complaint said that there were too many pictures of ashcans and girls hitching up their skirts on Horatio Street. So they took that and they said, yeah, that's what we're depicting, so we're gonna be ashcan. So these these 5 artists in particular would go on and would embrace sort of this ashcan name. And Prendergast, Shin, and Lawson didn't fit into this category. But with that in mind, now we're going to take a closer look at these paintings that were in the exhibition, as well as an additional painting by each artist that were included in the original 1908 exhibition. So this painting is titled Laughing Child by Robert Henry. And unlike the other members of the group, the bulk of Henry's paintings are actually singular portraits. He did produce some typical ashcan street scenes, but he really focused on portraiture and what he called real human characters. The realest characters of all, he felt, were children, because they had this sort of unabashed vitality and character. They hadn't been corrupted by anything yet. And this was his way of depicting contemporary life by those who were living it, rather than sort of these scenes like these other artists are doing. His style is impressionistic, with built-up layers of thick colors. His palette is dark, like Francisco Goya, but with strong contrasts of light that illuminate features such as the boy's grinning face. So we actually have 2 portraits by Henry in the American Realism exhibition. One of them looks very similar to this one, although it's not the same one. So make sure you go take a look, and you can really see these thick brush strokes and these really vital faces within this. So Henry depicted people from all different walks of life. Here's a Dutch soldier, and again, he's using these stark contrasts of dark and light to highlight features of the sitter. By the time Henry painted Dutch soldier, he had become a master of portraiture. The exploration of human personality had always been one of his greatest concerns, and he sympathetically identified with his sitters. Henry searched far and wide for different types of people, showing that there's not one type of American or one type of person. Although this was painted in Holland, his other portraits depict all walks of different life. And he directed his attention toward this full-faced military man with his upturned mustache and goatee. Henry caught his alert glance and the tense posture of the subject's arm held against his chest to give us a vivid, vital rendition of a unique human being. So next we're on to William Glacken's. So this painting, titled The Drive, Central Park, was painted around 1905 and depicts New Yorkers as they walk and take carriage rides through Central Park. It's a great example of what Henry was pushing for, scenes that depict real-life, mundane moments. There's really no moral to the story of this painting. Rather, it's just a moment of people enjoying their leisure in everyday life. The dark color and dramatic color palette are inspired by Dutch paintings Glacken saw while in Europe. And his later work, which you'll see in the American Realism exhibition, tends to feature a brighter color palette and more serene subjects like portraits and landscapes. This next painting, which I think is just beautiful, is titled At Moquin's, again by William Glackens, and is a glimpse into his private circle and private life. It depicts one of his favorite meeting spots, the New York restaurant Moquin's. In the painting, the woman on the left there, that is Jean Moquin, there we go, who is the wife of the owner of the restaurant. Next to her is a wealthy playboy and restaurateur, James B. Moore, who's talking to her and she's not interested in it. And in the reflection, we've actually identified this woman as Glacken's wife, and then this man up here in the corner as a popular art critic at the time, Charles Fitzgerald. So this is really a view into everyday life of an artist and people within New York City. Glackens uses vivid brushstrokes to depict Joan's dress, while depicting her with this sort of intent gaze that imbues the scene with tension and mystery. You can tell she's uninterested in what's going on around her. Maybe she's thinking about her role as a woman during this changing time. There's many different things that you can sort of think about with this painting. So our next artist, George Lux. he painted working class subjects and scenes of urban life. In this painting, titled Street Scene, it's just that, an eye-level view of a bustling street. Lux has positioned it so that you feel like you're standing just outside of the painting, looking in. In the front here is a cart where this man is carrying these goods. It looks like a toy that he's trying to get these children to get their parents to buy for them. He employed the early form of abstraction by making the faces in the forefront visible. You can see these faces pretty well here. But then as you go back farther into the painting, these figures really are just dots on there. You can kind of tell that they're people, but they're not really defined by anything. Lux's dark color palette is like many of the other Ashcan artists, but he does include these sort of vivid pops of red and orange to liven up his canvas. This other painting by Lux is titled Macaws, and is not as Ashcan as the other scene, although it does depict someone within their daily life. This woman who has these exotic macaws, which are not indigenous to North America. They're actually found in the humid forests of South America. And he actually did several paintings that included these macaws. So there was somebody in his life who collected these exotic birds that he often liked to depict. So, like I said before, I'm very disappointed that we didn't get any Everett Shins for this exhibition because he's actually one of my favorites from this group. But here we see a painting by him titled The White Ballet. And he, like the others within the group, looked at the modern world for inspiration, focusing on the crowds that visited the theater, opera, and circus, to which he referred to as uptown life. In this painting, titled White Ballet, he presents a cropped view of the orchestra pit, here, the stage with the dancers, and then the visitors who are watching this ballet. He spent, like many of his other colleagues, spent an extended period of time in Europe, and you can see right away, if you're familiar with any Degas paintings, this looks very similar to that, and he really drew inspiration from him. This is another painting by Shin, titled The Hippodrome, London, and it was significant because it was Shin's first painting devoted to what would become his signature style, these theaters, ballets, circuses, and he painted it while he was in London, and it depicts the Hippodrome, which opened in 1900 as a circus, but eventually turned into a music hall. Like the previous painting, Shin has cropped the perspective to only one view, and you're seeing a slice of what is happening. You see here, this is the upper deck of the venue, with the circus performer soaring through the air there. He uses this really interesting use of light by illuminating some of these faces in the front. You can see the doors propped open there, but then many of the faces are obscured by darkness. Our next artist, John Sloan, again focuses on city dwellers, mostly interacting in intimate settings like restaurants, saloons, ferry boats, and rooftops. His paintings are done in a painterly style, which means that you can really see the brush strokes of that. And they employ a dark color palette like his other colleagues, giving it an almost gritty feel, which often accompanies the subject that you're seeing. This painting is titled Election Night and depicts a moment of celebration on November 6th, 1907. A boisterous group of men, women, and children crowd into a narrow alley between the Herald Building here on the left and the raised train tracks of 6th Street on the right there. We know the exact location of this because John Sloan was an avid journalist. He had a diary that he wrote in every day. It's really interesting, you can find it online. He writes what artwork he worked on that day, where it was, where this inspiration came from. So he notes in his journal that he stumbled upon this moment, and it really, when he got there, he noted the frenzy of the crowd, the speed of the train, and the lights that illuminated this darkness, which he then tried to replicate in this painting. His quick brush strokes may distort some of the faces, but the way that he manipulates the paint on the canvas really emphasizes the dynamic movement of the crowd and pulls the viewer into this boisterous and chaotic scene. What we don't know is, and I tried to look it up, who had won this election or what this election was for. So in his private life, Sloan was a socialist, and he was really outspoken about socialism, but he was very particular about not including any of those socialist views in his artwork. So like this is election night, but he's not saying who won, not saying who he favored in it, so he really liked to keep those parts of his life separate. This is another painting by Sloan titled Hairdresser's Window, 6th Avenue, and depicts a hairdresser up here coloring this woman's hair. Below on the street, people pass by, and a few people are actually sort of mesmerized by what they're seeing here. These women have seen this before, they're not interested. They know they have to go next month. They don't want to deal with it right now. But these men are like, oh, what's going on there? And so he's really emphasizing just these sort of mundane moments within the city. He uses a kind of painterly style to physically emote the hustle and bustle of the city. And he also includes sort of some commentary in this. So you see all these different advertisements for things. He's pointing to sort of this rise in marketing and commercialism within the United States. And he's also commenting on the influx of immigration that was coming in from Ellis Island around the time. And we know this from this sign here that is advertising chop suey. So chop suey was a dish that was actually invented by Chinese immigrants who had come to America in the late 19th century. So he's really acknowledging this melding of cultures and what is happening in the country at this time. So now on to our last three artists, our non-Ashcan sort of anomalies. Maurice Prendergast and Arthur Davies, in my opinion, were the most avant-garde of these 8. So Prendergast had spent an extended period of time in Paris in the 1890s, where he studied the works of Vincent van Gogh and Georges Seurat, which you can see a direct influence in this. He adopted their post-impressionist style, which emphasized abstract qualities through short defined brushstrokes and broken swaths of color. His works are often set in leisure spaces, like you can see here. This is a crowded day in Central Park, and similar to the scene that we saw earlier by Blackens. But this is definitely through a much more abstract lens. The shapes of the figures in the forefront are sort of more clearly defined, although he doesn't define their faces. And then again, as we move back into the painting, they're really just these small swaths of color that are supposed to give the impression of a figure. This painting by Prendergast is titled Crepuscule. I know I butchered that, I'm so sorry, which is French for twilight, and depicts leisurely socializing in a park. The flattened figures, like his other ones, are not clearly defined, although he has defined them more here with this black outline around them. And you can see this very textured brush stroke within the work. So Ernest Lawson specialized in landscape scenes for much of his career, and his style lands somewhere sort of between Impressionism and Realism, although he never really conformed to one specific style. His paintings have been defined by others as lonely vistas devoid of people, which you'll see, this one does have people, although they're not really the main subject of this. And although his artwork didn't really represent it, he shared Henry and the other members of the group's concerns that the exhibition system in New York, the Academy, was too much of a private club and needed to be shaken up or dismantled. He's not working in an academic style, but he's not working in this Ashcan style. But regardless, he knew that artwork, regardless, should be exhibited. The next painting is more of this sort of lonely scene here. It's titled Abandoned Farm, and really is just that abandoned farm in the countryside. This looks very similar to the Lawson painting that we have in the American Realism exhibition. And last but not least is Arthur Davies, who definitely defies convention. And his paintings are hard to pinpoint what they are, what they represent, but they all have an ethereal or dreamlike quality to them. This painting, titled Across the Harbor, looks at a group of 5 women standing along the harbor here. They look like they're engaged in some sort of dance. I don't know, all doing these different motions. And again, that's sort of indicative of Davies' style. is not really telling you what's going on and giving you more of this dreamlike scene. And this last painting is also by Arthur Davies. This one we have a more clear image of what's happening. It's titled A Mighty Forest, Maenads. And in Greek mythology, Maenads were the followers of Dionysus, who's the god of wine. And what they would do is they would prepare his wine for him, and they would also drink it. And that combined with dancing, they would sort of access this frenzied, divine madness and ecstasy state. So they would be, you can see here, they're gallivanting around a forest, unclothed, just enjoying their sweet wine. Davies, I think this one is a little hard to see on the slideshow, but it is quite this dark red, which is I think a nod to the wine of Dionysus, but also sort of gives this sinister scene. So due to the success of the original 1908 exhibition at Macbeth Galleries, it was only open for from the 3rd to the 15th. And over 4,000 people visited the gallery during that time. It was incredibly crowded, and the success of it was off the charts of what they could ever have hoped. So after the success in New York, the 8 decided to travel this exhibition to 8 other cities, including Philadelphia, Chicago, Toledo, Detroit at the DIA, which at the time was known as the Detroit Museum of Art, Indianapolis, Pittsburgh, Bridgeport, and Newark. This was significant because, if this was new to New York City, this was new to all of these other cities as well, and was really exposing people to this new type of art and a new type of exhibition that went against academic art. So what happened next, and how did this lead to, as I said earlier, the rise of modernism in the United States? Because of the paintings we saw by the 8 artists are certainly avant-garde, I wouldn't really consider them that modern, but it was the fact that they held this exhibition and presented this new way of exhibiting an outdated system. And so what happens next is in December of 1911, there was the first meeting of what would become known as the Association of American Painters and Sculptors, or the AAPS for short. So 5 of the founding members of the AAPS included 5 of our 8 artists: Arthur Davies, William Blackens, Ernest Lawson, George Lux. So they got together with other artists of the time, like Jerome Myers and Walter Kuhn, and Davies was soon elected as the president of the organization. So on the screen is a newspaper article from 1912 announcing that they would be holding an exhibition. And the AAPS formed in order to create new exhibition opportunities for young artists outside the existing academic boundaries. Sound familiar? It's the same thing that the 8 had done a couple years prior. And this was really the nucleus and the heart of what the 8 were doing. So these artists who had participated in that wanted to grow this onto a larger scale. So they planned their first exhibition, dissatisfied with present methods of Academy of Design and its plans for the future. They want open exhibitions. So they planned an exhibition that would be called the International Exhibition of Modern Art. The goal of the exhibition was to expose the greater public to avant-garde European and American artists. And despite any backlash that they got from the 8 exhibition, although it was favored by many, the Academy was still on the strict path of academic art. So despite what had happened with the 8, they didn't change their ways. So these artists knew that they had to keep digging at them in order to change, and they never really did. Although they went out of fashion and other groups came to the forefront. So like the 8's exhibition, this was the antithesis of the academic tradition. The exhibition was set to open at the 69th Regiment Armory, and this is where the title of the Armory Show, which you may have heard of before, comes from. It was called the International Exhibition of Modern Art, but most of us call it the Armory Show now. And it would feature about 1,300 paintings, sculpture, and decorative works by over 300 avant-garde European and American artists, including those 5 founding members of the AAPS, who are also part of our 8. This is a view of what was the Cubist room. So it was during this exhibition that the American public was exposed to European modernism for the very first time. Many artists had been exposed to it because they had traveled to Europe to see it, but the greater public who hadn't been to Europe had no idea that this was going on over there. So the public was exposed to styles like Impressionism, Fauvism, and Cubism for the very first time. And you may have heard the lore about this. So one of the most well-known, radical, and controversial artworks on view at the Armory Show is this work you see on the screen here. I have the wrong caption, I'm so sorry about that. But it's titled Nude Descending a Staircase, #2, by French artist Marcel Duchamp. Now, when the public saw this, it was a scandal. People were outraged. They were looking at this saying, what is this? This isn't art. It does depict this figure, a nude figure, coming down a staircase, although it's done in a cubist form, and it's from very many different views. So it's this figure going down multiple times. Regardless of this scandal, people started to really accept modern art after this exhibition. The Armory Show exposed the public to a new language of abstract art and expressionism, and brought the style of European avant-garde to the recognition of American critics and artists alike. Many, like the 5 members of the 8 who were exhibited, are not nearly on this modern caliber as Marcel Duchamp, but regardless, show the different ways that American art could be art. Despite the criticism of the Armory Show, modernism ended up establishing itself within the artistic traditions of the United States and expanded the aesthetic expectations of American art audiences. Additionally, New York became the locus for the exhibition and sale of modern art during and after World War II. And in short, the Armory Show was transformational for the American art world, which we could do a whole other lecture on the Armory Show. And the concept really came from this idea that the 8 had set forward before. And within 20 years of this, the landscape of American art would change so that modernism was really the standard at the time. Academic art was long over, the ashcan was also getting to be out of style, and modernism was coming to the forefront. And none of this, I argue, could have been achieved without those original 8 men who had the courage to go up against the Academy and fight against the status quo with this 1908 exhibition. And that's all I have. Thank you. Do you have any questions? Yes?
Questions about the Academy. Was
Yes.
it originally just oil paintings, or were there other media involved?
There were other mediums as well. There was sculpture, mostly sculpture, paintings, and works on paper. And so those sculptures were very much academic as well, so showing gods and saints and mythology and stuff like that.
Were all the works available for purchase?
Yes, they were. Yep.
Do we know how much the artist might have made out of the show or not?
No. I do know that at the 8's exhibition, the first one, 7 paintings were sold of the 63. And several of those were actually to Gertrude Whitney, who ended up opening the Whitney Museum. So that does give us a sense of how much they were, but yeah.
Is the Macbeth gallery still?
It's not, no, it's
Because I
closed.
noticed the date on the picture, was that when it closed officially, or did it?
No, it
actually-
stayed open, I think, till shortly after World War II. I think when William Macbeth passed away, it closed after that. But then, by then, after this exhibition, there were other galleries who saw that these independent exhibitions could be successful. So that's sort of when they started popping up and filling in, like you see today in New York City.
That was gonna be my next question, is if the exhibition actually caused more problems for his business than helped it? 'Cause
No, it
it's
definitely
swing
helped
both
it.
ways.
Yes, and it really was due to the amount of press that the exhibition got. If Hen Ryan and these other artists hadn't had these, close associations with the press and we're really pushing it to be in there, I don't think it would have been as successful. But yeah, Macbeth Gallery went on to be very successful in exhibiting modern American art after that.
Did the Academy ever change their attitude?
No. Not really. Yes.
Is there a painting in the FIA collection from this group?
So yes, so in the American Realism exhibition, we have a couple paintings. The first one, when you walk in, by John Sloan, is from us. We have a Henry painting, Maurice Prendergast, and then a couple John Sloan works on paper. So you can see when you go in there on the label, it'll say who owns it. But yes, quite a few are from there, but not from the actual exhibition, just by the artist.
So they're owned by the FIA?
Yes, yep, correct. Yes.
Earlier than all of this, the Impressionists were being rejected by the Paris Salons, right?
Yes.
How did that affect the group of 8? Did it encourage them to, we can strike out on our own?
It definitely did, yeah, because most of them had spent an extended period of time in Europe, and so they were exposed to that, and they knew what these artists were going through. And they knew that they really just had to keep pushing and pushing, and that eventually it would be accepted, but it was going to take manpower and fortitude to really get it to the forefront.
Rachel, how long did it take for women to break into the Little Boys Club?
Oh, quite a while.
Work in progress.
So I would say women really started to be taken seriously after World War II. Because of opportunities during World War II with the WPA and employing, because they had this democratic approach to employment, and because many men were away at war, the WPA, which was the government-sponsored art program, they employed women to make murals, graphic arts, and that really helped women break into the scene. But it's still today for women is a struggle for them to, be taken at the same caliber as men. But definitely during this time, there were women who were taking art classes that were students of Henry, but they weren't being exhibited publicly or selling their paintings or anything like that. Yes.
Do you happen to know who the first women to break into it is? Or were?
No, but so we actually had an exhibition that closed in the graphics gallery before the one was in there that I curated called Women Printmakers 1900 to 1950 to kind of go along with American Realism. And, there was sort of this nucleus of artists that sort of were all pushing it together. These women, one of the things that they did in order to be taken seriously is they started their own sort of women's clubs and these women's groups. So they knew that they couldn't do it alone, so they would get together with their friends and they would have a group and then they would try to get exhibited together. So it really was more of a group effort. Yes?
Did the Academy eventually close or morph into something else?
It eventually closed for a little bit. I'm not positive if it's still open today, but it really went out of fashion because they weren't open to committing to these new styles.
Was willing to grow, so they died.
Yes, exactly. Yes, I think I saw. Yeah.
So I just want so in terms of this time frame, so the Armory show, and just before that, didn't Alfred Stieglitz start having his exhibitions?
Yes.
Bringing in the European modern
Yeah.
artists, and he probably had interactions and even exhibited some of these artists' works, perhaps.
Yes, exactly.
And
It
of
was
course,
just.
in terms of a woman, he was the one that brought Georgia O'Keeffe
Yes.
into New York City, started exhibiting her work around this time. But after all of this happened, and you mentioned something about 20 years until it really broke open, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney with her museum
Yeah.
and the Museum of Modern Art, did they come in the late 20s, early 30s?
Yes.
And really pulled this all together?
Absolutely, exactly. Yes.
The Ashcan School, was
Mhm.
a real school?
No, it was just a name. So that's what's kind of confusing about it. There was no sort of united front. There wasn't a school where people went to learn this. It was just a name that was given to them. And it came after the fact. So a lot of these art names like Impressionism, Post-Impressionism weren't given the name while the artists were actively working in it. It came kind of years after in some cases. So it's sort of applied as we're looking back. Yes?
After the show, the first show with the 8, did that affect American art showing in Europe? Did they begin to take it more seriously, or did it not have an effect?
That's a great question. I didn't really look into that, and from what I know is in Europe, they mostly focused on European artists because they were a little bit ahead of the trend of us. They were kind of doing other things, but that's a great question. All right, well, I want to thank you all for coming today. Your questions were great. You're a great audience, and we appreciate all your support of the FIA. Thank you.